The first body dropped from the ridge just after dawn, tumbling through laurel and rhododendron, to land at Colonel Marcus Ashford's feet, with a sound like a sack of grain hitting a wagon bed. Except Crane didn't bleed. Crane didn't have a woman's arrow through its throat. Ashford's horse reared, and somewhere in the trees above, invisible as smoke, someone laughed, a sound that made his 50 armed men reach for their weapons and find nothing but shadows to aim at. "Welcome to the hollows, Colonel," a woman's voice called down, clear as creek water and cold as December stone. "You came to take our mine. Let's see if you can take your lives back down the mountain." That was how the war began, the one the history books would never record, the one fought by women with calloused hands and muskets their dead husbands left behind, the one that would teach powerful men a lesson written in blood and gunpowder. Never underestimate what a mountain woman will do when you try to steal what's hers. But to understand how it came to bodies falling from ridges and women becoming warriors, you have to go back 3 weeks earlier, to an October morning when Sarah Kettering stood at the mouth of a salt mine and decided that enough was finally enough. The mine shaft breathed like a wounded thing, exhaling dust and darkness into the October morning. Sarah Kettering stood at its mouth, her hands wrapped in strips of linen that had once been white, now the color of rust and earth. The bandages did little to hide the burns that marked her palms, burns from the ropes she'd pulled day after day, hauling buckets of salt from the deep places where no woman should have to go. But women went anyway. They always had, here in the hollows of Western Virginia, where the mountains kept their secrets and the earth gave up its treasures only to those willing to bleed for them. "Sarah." The call came from behind her, sharp with warning. She turned to see Esther McLean running up the path, her skirts hitched high above her ankles, her face flushed with something more than exertion. Fear, Sarah recognized, the kind that made your blood run cold even in the warmth of autumn. "They're coming," Esther gasped, catching Sarah's arm. "The magistrate and his men, they mean to take the mine." Sarah felt something harden in her chest, that old familiar stone that had been growing there since her husband Thomas died in the collapse 3 winters past. Since the company men had come with their papers and their lies, St. Thomas had owed money, saying his claim was forfeit, saying Sarah had no right to what her family had carved from the mountain with their own hands and suffering. "Let them come," Sarah said quietly, but her eyes moved past Esther to the other women emerging from their cabins. The McLean sisters, Esther and Rebecca, and fierce young Mary, old widow Haskell with her rifle, the Brennan girls, barely more than children, but with hands as calloused as any man's, Catherine Yont with her quiet strength and her knowledge of herbs and poisons, and more, a dozen more, women whose men had died in the mines or been pressed into militia service to fight the British or the Cherokee, or whoever the colonial powers decided was the enemy that season. They had kept the salt works running through it all. Salt for preserving meat, salt for tanning hides, salt worth more than silver in these mountains, where winter lasted half the year and nothing grew when the ground froze hard as iron. The mine was their livelihood, their survival, their birthright. And now Colonel Marcus Ashford wanted to take it from them. The magistrate arrived at midday with 20 armed men, their red coats dusty from the road, their faces set with the particular arrogance of those who believe the law is whatever serves their interests. At their head rode Ashford himself, a man grown fat on other people's labor, his jowls quivering as his horse picked its way up the rocky path. The women had gathered at the mine entrance, a wall of homespun and determination. Sarah stood at their center, her father's old musket, the one that had killed Shawnee warriors in the old wars, held across her body like a promise. "Mrs. Kettering," Ashford called out, not bothering to dismount, "I have here a writ of seizure. This mine and all its workings are to be remanded to the Crown's representatives, namely myself, in satisfaction of debts and back taxes owed." "There are no debts," Sarah replied, her voice carrying across the clearing. "My husband paid what was owed. We all have. This mine belongs to the families who work it." Ashford's face reddened. "Your husband was a rebel and a debtor. His claims are void. Now stand aside, or my men will move you aside." What happened next would be remembered in the hollows for generations. Sarah Kettering raised her musket, not pointing it at anyone, just raising it so the sun caught the barrel. Around her, the other women did the same. Guns, axes, mining picks, even old Widow Haskell's wicked-looking scythe. "Colonel," Sarah said, and her voice was soft as a mother singing a lullaby, "you can try. But we are mountain women, and we have buried our dead before. We can bury more." For a long moment, the clearing was silent, except for the sigh of wind through pine trees and the distant cry of a hawk. Then Ashford laughed, a sound like rocks sliding. "Very well. We'll return with proper force. And when we do, Mrs. Kettering, there will be no mercy. Not for you, not for any of these treasonous whores." He wheeled his horse around, and his men followed. But as they rode away, Sarah saw one of them look back, a lieutenant with cold eyes and a scar bisecting his left cheek. He was memorizing faces, she realized, memorizing them for what would come next. That night, the women gathered in Sarah's cabin, the largest of the rough structures clustered around the mine. Catherine Yount had brought her medicine bag and was tending to the burns on Sarah's hands with a salve that smelled of comfrey and beeswax. The others sat in a rough circle, their faces lit by the fire and the single tallow candle burning on the table. "They'll come back," Rebecca McLean said. What had been an observation in the morning was now a certainty in the darkness. "And they'll come with more men." "Aye," agreed Widow Haskell. She was the oldest among them, nearly 60, with a face like weathered oak and eyes that had seen the French wars. "They'll come with enough men to make examples of us." "Then we leave," said one of the Brennan girls, the younger one barely 16. "We take what we can carry and disappear into the mountains." "And give them the mine?" Sarah's voice cracked like a whip. "Give them what our men died for, what we've bled for? No." "Then what?" Mary McLean demanded. She was the youngest of the McLean sisters, not yet 20, with red hair and a temper to match. "We can't fight the whole colonial army, Sarah. We're good shots, aye, but they have cannon. They have cavalry. What do we have?" "We have the mountains," Sarah said slowly, an idea forming in her mind, like crystal, growing in the deep dark of the mine. "We have the hollows and the caves and every hidden path for 50 miles. We have the knowledge of where a man can walk and where he'll break his neck. And we have something else." She looked around the circle, meeting each woman's eyes in turn. We have rage, righteous rage, the kind that can burn hotter than any forge fire. Catherine Yunt spoke up, her voice quiet but clear. You're talking about revenge. I'm talking about justice, Sarah corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Esther McLean asked, and there was no challenge in her voice, only genuine curiosity. Sarah considered this. Outside, the October wind was rising, bringing with it the smell of coming winter. Soon the high passes would be snowed in, and the world would shrink to these few square miles of mountain valley. Ashford would come before then. He would come with his men and his guns, and his absolute certainty that he had the right to take whatever he wanted. And if he succeeded, other women in other hollows would learn that they too could be dispossessed, that their labor and loss meant nothing against a magistrate's writ and a colonel's creed. Justice is what you get in a court of law, Sarah said finally. Revenge is what you take when the law has failed you. So maybe they're the same thing after all, at least out here where the law is whatever a man with a gun says it is. Then let's make our own law, Mary McLean said fiercely. And so they did. They had 2 weeks, they figured, before Ashford could assemble enough men to enforce his claim. 2 weeks to prepare for what Sarah had begun calling, with grim humor, the reckoning. The first thing they did was inventory their resources. They had 37 women and girls old enough to fight, plus a handful of boys too young for militia service. They had 22 working firearms, muskets and rifles of various vintages and reliability, plus powder and shot enough for perhaps 3 volleys each. They had the tools of their trade, picks and shovels, axes and hammers, coils of rope that could easily become snares. And they had the mine itself. Sarah and Catherine descended into its depths by torchlight, following the main shaft down to where it branched into a warren of passages carved over generations. The salt deposits ran through the mountain in veins, and the miners had followed them deep into the earth, shoring up the tunnels with timber as they went. Here, Catherine said, pointing to a section where the ceiling was supported by a framework of posts and crossbeams. If these were cut, this whole section would collapse. Burying anyone inside, Sarah finished. She studied the timbers, calculating. Could we do it selectively, collapse some tunnels but not others? Aye, if we were careful, and if we knew exactly where we wanted people to be when it happened. They spent the next 3 days mapping the mine in detail, marking which passages could be collapsed safely, and which would bring down the whole mountain. Catherine proved to have an unexpected talent for this sort of strategic thinking. She had learned from her father, she explained, who had been a military engineer before he deserted and disappeared into the mountains. He taught me how armies think, she said, as they sat in the main tunnel, drawing diagrams by candlelight. How they move, how they secure ground, and how to make ground impossible to secure. Meanwhile, above ground, the other women were preparing in their own ways. The McLean sisters took to the woods, setting snares and deadfalls along the approach paths. They were expert hunters, having kept their family fed for years, and they knew how to make a trap that would kill quickly and quietly. Widow Haskell organized the younger girls into watches, teaching them the old signals, bird calls and drumbeats that could carry messages across miles of mountain. Soon they had a communication network that stretched from the mine to every cabin and farm in the hollow. and Esther McLean, who had a gift for leadership that rivaled Sarah's own, began drilling the women in basic tactics. Not standing in lines and firing on command. That was how armies fought, and they were not an army. Instead, she taught them how to move silently through the forest, how to fire and withdraw, how to use the terrain to multiply their numbers. "We can't fight them straight on," Esther explained during one of these sessions. "But we can bleed them, make them afraid, make them wish they'd never heard of this hollow." On the 8th day, a rider came up the mountain. He was a boy from the settlement down in the valley, barely 14, riding a sway-backed mare and bringing news that made Sarah's blood run cold. Ashford had assembled a force of 50 men, not just militia, but professional soldiers, veterans of the frontier wars. They were bringing a small cannon, the boy said, and chains to bind the women who resisted. They planned to arrest Sarah and the other leaders, hang them for treason, and sell the rest into indentured servitude to pay the supposed debts. "They're saying you're rebels," the boy reported, his voice breaking with adolescent panic. "They're saying you're in league with the British or the Cherokee or the devil himself. People are believing it, Mom. They're saying you women have gone mad up here in the mountains." "Maybe we have," Sarah said quietly, pressing a coin into the boy's hand. "But madness is sometimes the only sane response to an insane world. Thank you for the warning." After the boy left, Sarah called the women together one final time. She stood before them in the gathering dusk, her shadow long across the clearing, and spoke without preamble. "They're coming in 3 days with 50 men and a cannon. They mean to destroy us, one way or another. So I'm giving anyone who wants to leave the chance to go now, tonight, with no shame and my blessing. Take your children and your valuables and disappear into the mountains. Find new lives where no one knows your names." No one moved. "Or," Sarah continued, and now her voice hardened into something that rang like steel on stone, "you can stay and fight. Not for the mine, not for the salt. Those are just things. But for the principle that we decide our own fates, that we bow to no man who claims authority over us by force alone, that we are not property to be seized or livestock to be managed." Mary McLean stood up, her red hair catching the last light of day, like a banner. I stay, echoed Esther. "I stay," said Catherine Yont and Widow Haskell and the Brennan girls, and all the others, one by one, until their voices became a chorus, a declaration, an oath sealed in the mountain air. "Then we had better get to work," Sarah said, "because in 3 days we're going to teach Colonel Ashford and every man like him a lesson they'll never forget. We're going to show them what happens when you try to take from mountain women what they've earned in blood and tears. We're going to become their nightmare." In the darkness, someone laughed, a sound as sharp and bright as breaking glass. They came at dawn on the 3rd day, exactly as predicted. 52 men in all, moving up the mountain path in a column, their bayonets catching the early light. The cannon came behind, hauled by oxen and accompanied by its crew, moving slowly over the rough ground. Sarah watched them from a position high on the ridge, concealed among the laurel thickets. Beside her, Mary McLean lay prone with her rifle, already calculating ranges. Further along the ridge, invisible among the rocks and shadows, a dozen other women waited with weapons and cold determination. Confident, aren't they? Mary whispered, coming right up the main path. They don't think we're a threat, Sarah replied. They think we're frightened women who'll surrender the moment we see overwhelming force. They're about to learn different. Sarah waited until the column was fully committed to the path, spread out along the narrow track with steep slopes on both sides. Then she gave the signal. 3 quick strikes on the hollow log that served as their drum. The first trap was simple but effective. A massive deadfall, tons of logs and boulders held in place by a cunningly concealed rope, came crashing down onto the rear of the column. Men screamed as they were crushed or knocked from the path into the ravine below. The column's neat order dissolved into chaos. Before they could recover, the women opened fire from their concealed positions. The musket balls weren't aimed to kill, not yet. Instead, they targeted the officers, the men who stood out by their bearing or their uniforms, and they targeted the oxen pulling the cannon. Mary McLean's rifle cracked, and one of the beasts went down, bellowing. Its partner panicked, trying to bolt, and the cannon's wheels caught on a rock. The entire apparatus tipped sideways, sliding toward the edge of the ravine as men scrambled to secure it. "Fall back," Sarah called, and the women vanished into the forest like smoke, leaving behind only gun smoke and the echo of shots and the screams of wounded men. Ashford's response was predictable. He sent soldiers after them, hunters who knew the mountains, but the women knew them better. They led the soldiers on, deeper into the woods, and then the forest itself became their weapon. Snares caught men's legs, yanking them upward to dangle helpless from branches. Pit traps concealed beneath fallen leaves gave way under weight, dropping soldiers into darkness. And when the soldiers tried to help their trapped comrades, the women would fire from new positions, always moving, never giving their pursuers a clean target. By midday, Ashford had lost a third of his men, killed, wounded, or simply too demoralized to continue. He pulled back to regroup at the base of the mountain, setting up a defensive camp and posting guards. "They'll try again tonight or tomorrow," Esther predicted, as the women gathered in a cave system they'd prepared as a fallback position. "He can't go back without the mine. It would destroy his reputation." "Then we give him what he wants," Sarah said, and explained her plan. That night, using signals and runners, they spread word through the mountains. By dawn, another 30 women had arrived from the neighboring hollows. Women who had heard what was happening and decided their fates were bound together. They brought food, ammunition, and their own rage at men who thought they could take whatever they pleased. Among the newcomers was a woman Sarah had heard of but never met, Black Martha, a freed woman who had been enslaved on a tidewater plantation before escaping into the mountains years before. She was tall and strong, with tribal scars on her cheeks and eyes that had seen things Sarah could barely imagine. "Heard you were making trouble for the authorities," Martha said by way of greeting. "Thought I'd join in. Been wanting to kill me some slavers and tyrants for a long time now." "The more the merrier," Sarah replied, and meant it. The second attack came that afternoon. Ashford had abandoned subtlety and brought his full force straight up the main path toward the mine entrance, trusting in numbers and firepower to overwhelm any resistance. The women let them come. They let them reach the mine entrance, let them see it apparently undefended. let Ashford himself dismount and stride toward the opening with triumph written across his fat face. They let his men begin to relax, to think the worst was over. Then Catherine Yunt, who had been waiting in the mine's depths with a carefully prepared fuse, lit the charges. The explosion was enormous. Not enough to bring down the mountain, but enough to collapse the entrance tunnel and the first 100 feet of shaft behind it, sending a blast of rock and dust and splintered timber roaring out of the mine mouth. Men were flung backward by the concussion. Others were buried under the debris. The sound echoed across the hollows like thunder, and a dust cloud rose into the sky like a signal fire. In the chaos that followed, the women struck from every direction at once. They poured fire into the confused mass of soldiers, who couldn't tell where the shots were coming from, who couldn't form ranks or organize a response because they were trapped in the narrow clearing, with death coming from the forest on all sides. Sarah saw Ashford trying to rally his men, saw him grab a lieutenant and point toward the tree line, ordering a charge. She took aim with her father's old musket, the one that had never failed her, and fired. The ball took Ashford in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. The lieutenant, the one with the scarred face who had memorized their faces, moved to help him, and Mary McLean's rifle spoke. The scarred man fell and didn't rise. "Retreat!" someone was shouting. "Retreat!" The soldiers broke and ran, abandoning their wounded, abandoning the useless cannon, abandoning everything but their desperate need to escape the mountain and the demons who haunted it. They fled down the path in disorder, and the women let them go, but they made sure the fleeing men knew they were being watched, that rifles tracked them all the way down to the valley floor. When the dust settled and the gun smoke cleared, Sarah walked down to the clearing. Ashford lay where he'd fallen, bleeding but alive, his face gray with shock and pain. Around him lay the dead and dying, 20 men at least, perhaps more. The cost of his greed measured in blood and broken bodies. Sarah knelt beside him, her musket across her knees. "You came to take our mine," she said conversationally. "You came with your papers and your guns and your certainty that might makes right. Did it ever occur to you, Colonel, that we might feel the same way?" Ashford tried to speak, but only blood came out. Sarah watched him dispassionately. She had seen men die before, her husband, her father, her brother, all taken by the mountains or the wars or the 1,000 casual violences of frontier life. She had no more pity left for men who brought violence upon themselves. "Take him," she said to Esther and Catherine. "Bind his wound. We'll send him back to the valley alive. Let him tell everyone what happened here. Let him be our message." They sent Ashford down the mountain 3 days later, tied to his horse, his wound treated, but his spirit broken. With him went a letter, written in Sarah's careful hand, and signed by all the women. It read, "To the magistrates and authorities of Virginia, know that the women of the mountain hollows are no man's property. We have defended what is ours by right of labor and loss. We have shown mercy where none was offered to us. We ask now only to be left in peace to work our minds and raise our children and live our lives as free people. But know also this, if you come for us again, we will not be so merciful. We have learned the arts of war. We have proven ourselves capable of defending our homes, and we will do so again as many times as necessary, until you accept that we will not submit to theft dressed up in legal language. We are the women of the mountains. We will not be moved. The letter caused a sensation in the Tidewater settlements. Some called the women heroes, defenders of property rights and colonial liberties. Others called them criminals, rebels, unwomanly abominations who had forgotten their place. But what mattered was this: no more soldiers came to take the mine. Oh, there were consequences. The mine was declared forfeit by the colonial government, its output embargoed. But the women went on working it anyway, selling their salt through smugglers and traders who asked no questions. The embargoes were unenforceable this far into the mountains, where the government's writ meant little, and survival meant everything. Life returned to its rhythms, though changed in subtle ways. The women had proven something to themselves and to the world, that they could fight, that they could win, that they were nobody's victims. Young girls grew up hearing the story of the battle, and they learned to shoot straight and stand their ground. Sarah Kettering became something of a legend, though she would have preferred to remain just a widow working her husband's claim. People came from other hollows, seeking her advice on how to resist encroachment by the powerful. She gave it freely, always emphasizing the importance of unity and preparation. They'll always come for what's yours if they think they can take it, she would tell these visitors. The trick is to make them think again, make the cost too high, make the fight too hard, make them afraid of mountain women. Catherine Yunt married a blacksmith from the next valley over and had 3 daughters, all of whom she taught to fight and think strategically. The McLean sisters never married but lived together on their family land, which grew into a prosperous farm. Mary McLean became a legendary hunter and was said to have once killed a panther with her bare hands, though Sarah suspected that story might have grown in the telling. Widow Haskell lived another 10 years and died in her sleep at 70, her rifle propped beside her bed and her powder horn full. Black Martha stayed in the mountains and became a conduit for other escaped slaves seeking freedom in the hollows. She and Sarah became close friends, 2 women who had fought for their liberty and won. As for the mine, it operated for another 30 years under the women's control. They ran it efficiently and fairly, sharing the profits according to how much each family worked. When the revolution came a few years later, they sided with the rebels, not out of any great political conviction, but because the British represented the same kind of authority that Ashford had, the kind that thought it could dictate terms to people who had carved lives from rock and blood. Some of the women fought in the war. Mary McLean became a scout and was at Yorktown when Cornwallis surrendered. Others kept the mine running, providing salt to the Continental Army at fair prices, their contribution to independence quiet but essential. And every year on the anniversary of the battle, the women would gather at the mine entrance, sealed permanently after that first explosion, but left as a monument. They would share a meal and tell stories and make sure their daughters and granddaughters knew what had happened there. How a group of women had said no to men who expected obedience. How they had fought and won. How they had created, for a little while, their own kind of justice. Sarah Kettering was 73 years old when she made her last climb to the old mine entrance. It was spring, and the mountain laurel was blooming, white and pink flowers cascading down the slopes like snow that had forgotten to melt. She was a grandmother many times over now, her hair white as the laurel blooms, her hands twisted with age but still strong enough to grip a walking stick. Behind her came her daughter Ruth, and Ruth's daughters, and their daughters too, 4 generations of mountain women. They reached the clearing where the battle had been fought 35 years before. The forest had reclaimed it, trees growing where men had died, wildflowers blooming in soil enriched by old blood. The sealed mine entrance was visible only as a depression in the ground, a place where the earth had fallen in on itself and created something new. "Tell us again, grandmother," said the youngest girl, barely 6 years, old but already fierce in the way of mountain children. So Sarah told the story one more time, leaving nothing out, not the fear, not the violence, not the terrible cost of choosing to fight. She told it the way it had happened, without romance or embellishment, because she believed the truth was important, even when it was hard. "Why did they want to take it from you?" the girl asked when Sarah finished. "The mine." "Because they could," Sarah replied. "Or at least, they thought they could. That's what powerful men do, child. They take what they can from those they think are too weak to stop them. But you stopped them. We did. And paid for it in nightmares and scars and friends who didn't survive. Violence always has a cost, even when it's necessary." Sarah looked around the clearing, seeing ghosts in the dappled sunlight. But some things are worth a cost: freedom, dignity, the right to keep what you've earned. Those are worth fighting for. The little girl considered this with the seriousness children bring to important matters. "If someone tries to take from us, will we fight too?" Sarah smiled, though there was sadness in it. "I hope you never have to. I hope the world becomes a place where women don't need to take up guns to be treated as human beings with rights and dignity. But if that day hasn't come by the time you're grown." She let the sentence trail off, but the girl understood. They all understood. The lesson of the mountains was simple. You protect what's yours, you stand with your sisters, and you never, ever let anyone make you small. As they walked back down the mountain, Sarah heard singing. Her daughter had started it, an old song the women had made up after the battle. And now the others joined in, their voices rising through the trees. "We are the daughters of stone and root, born of the mountain, hard and true. Try to break us, try to own us, and learn what mountain women can do." The song followed them down through the forest, a sound like the wind itself, wild and free, and impossible to contain. And Sarah Kettering, who had been young and afraid and furious once upon a time, who had learned to turn that fury into power, smiled and walked on, her descendants beside her, her legacy secured not in silver or salt, but in the fierce hearts of mountain women who would never bow. Behind them, the mountain kept its secrets, and the sealed mine slept in darkness, a reminder carved in stone and shadow of what women could do when they decided that enough was enough. The hollows remembered, the forests whispered the tale, and in the years to come, whenever someone asked about the abandoned mine and the battle fought there, the answer would always be the same. That was where the women of the mountains taught the world a lesson it wouldn't soon forget. That was where they wrote their own law in blood and powder smoke. That was where they proved that justice and revenge could be the same thing, when the law had failed and only strength remained. That was where they became legends, and the mountain, ancient and implacable, held the story in its stone heart and would hold it forever, long after the last human voice fell silent and the forest claimed everything. The mountain remembered. The mountain always remembered. For in the end, that was the truest revenge of all, not just to win the battle, but to ensure the story survived, to make certain that everyone who came after knew what had happened here. To pass the tale from mother to daughter like a precious heirloom, polished with each retelling until it gleamed. The women of the mountain hollows had fought for their mine and their freedom. But more than that, they had fought for the right to be remembered on their own terms, not as victims or tragic figures, but as warriors who had stood their ground and won. And they were remembered. Oh, they were remembered. The mountains made sure of that.